So good evening, everybody. Welcome. So glad that you could join us this evening. Y'all probably know me too well. I'm Chris Vaneman. I'm the Dean of the School of the Arts here at Converse, and I'm excited to be able to welcome Kayoko Dan, the conductor of tonight's concert, Dr. Peter Kay, the orchestra's general manager and composer in residence, who has composed what I think is going to be a really interesting and beautiful piece that we'll be beginning this concert with tonight. But let's start off by getting to know, most of you kind of know Peter as well. Peter's like me, he's been here for a few years. But Kayoko, you are the newbie in the room,
yes,
as it were, and some of these folks have had an opportunity to get to hear you talk a little bit in various settings like the Piedmont Club, but a lot of them haven't. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your kind of musical and personal background? How did you end up getting into conducting that you find yourself here tonight?
Okay, so my name is Kayoko. So happy to be here. Had a really wonderful week working with your musicians. It was absolutely wonderful. You included.
Thank you.
And excited to do a world premiere of Peter's piece tonight. And to be so happy to be like part of this whole celebration of coming back together and sharing the music, wonderful music with you live tonight. So thank you for having me. So I think I'm going to go backwards to where I am now, and you can go backwards. So currently I serve as the music director of Chattanooga Symphony in Tennessee, and I concurrently serve as the director of orchestras at Sam Houston State University near Houston. And I've done music director of a youth orchestra in Kentucky, and I've served as assistant conductor of Phoenix Symphony previous to that. And I went to 2 state schools, Arizona State and University of Texas at Austin. But my main instrument is flute.
I know it well.
Yeah, and no offense, but the thing about flute players, we're kind of bossy people.
True.
So when I would play in chamber music a lot in college, and it would be like woodwind quintet or quartet trio, flute quartet, whatever. I somehow was always in charge of like people, like calling. At the time we didn't have like text messages, so we would be calling people, booking rooms, and the leadership role always fell on my lap. So it was a very natural progression for me to become a conductor. And originally my first 2 degrees are in music ed, and my original plan was to be a high school marching band director because I grew up in Texas, and I'm a flute player, and that's what you do. But along the way, I fell in love with the string orchestra sound, and I decided that this is what I was going to do, and I'm doing. So I'm just extremely fortunate to be doing what I'm doing and actually making a living off of it, which is a privilege.
Yeah. So an aside, by the way, to anybody who might have a wedding in their potential future, if you're thinking of marrying a flutist, be careful, because she's right. We are a little bit in the bossy side. Really, anybody who plays the top line.
Yeah. Trumpet
Players, be careful with the trumpet players. Violin players can be kind of high maintenance. Sopranos, yeah. So having decided that you were interested in pursuing conducting, what is the step that you go to at that point to say, I think, once you've made up your mind,
yeah.
What do you do? How do you what's the first step along that road?
Okay, so I did not grow up in a musical family, so I was very clueless about this whole profession. So I didn't know that people who look like me don't conduct professional orchestras. I just thought I want to conduct, and that's what I was doing. So I got my master's degree in music ed / orchestra, and then my doctorate in conducting. And I just wanted to keep conducting, and I thought with a doctorate I can teach college. But somehow, my last year, my doctorate degree, my teacher, Tim Russell, who's the ballet conductor of Arizona, they were like renovating the concert hall. So instead of doing 20 shows of Nutcracker, that one year we were in the smaller hall, so we did 28 shows of Nutcracker in 3 weeks. And physically, you cannot conduct 28 shows in 3 weeks. So he said, you do half and I'll do half. So that was my first professional gig. And it just so happens that the Phoenix Symphony musicians were accompanying the Ballet Arizona. So they saw me work and they invited me to audition. So that's how it opened up the door for me. So I didn't know anything about the world, this world of professional orchestras, and I just kept conducting, and that's what I kept pursuing.
So the Phoenix Symphony thing sort of happened, and they liked you, and that just led to the next step, which led to the next step.
Yeah, that was, next step was the youth orchestra. I was a music director, and that's where I gained the skill to be a leader of an organization and just managing other conductors and one staff. But doing fundraising and event planning, and since it was just me and the one office person, we did everything we could, and it prepared me for the next job too.
So very often, conductors tend to often come from the world of pianists.
Yeah.
Pianists are studying scores all the time. They can play all the harmonies themselves and stuff, and they kind of stumble in that direction into conducting. But you, with a background in music education, I would expect that actually gives you some interesting advantages that we don't always run into in conductors.
Yeah, I think it was for me important to be able to play flute at the best of my ability during my college time, because I knew the more experience I had in orchestra, and you have to be the better players at UT Austin, it's such a competitive group to get into, and as an undergrad, I wanted to be the best as I can, so I can be in an orchestra and have the experience of sitting in an orchestra and watching a conductor and being surrounded by the string sound. But I think one of the crucial thing about being a conductor is knowing how to rehearse, knowing how to communicate how I want the sound to sound like to the musicians. And sitting in an orchestra and experiencing from the other end really helps you put more tools in the conductor rehearsal box, So I think being a performer, orchestral instrument performer, really helped me develop my skill as a conductor.
And I suspect you also have to really work out the skill of diagnosing a problem very quickly,
right,
and communicating that to the players very simply
right,
and succinctly.
Yeah.
That if you had training and explaining that kind of stuff to kids,
right,
then that probably is going to help you actually communicate directly with professionals in a way.
Actually, professionals prefer to be more concise than students. Students tolerate me blabbering about things, but professionals, I have to be so concise because we're on the clock, right? We have 2.5 hours with 15-minute break in between. So you get basically 2 hours and 15 minutes to do whatever I needed to do. So I don't have time to waste. So it's like boom, 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 this is what we need to fix. And I actually been a certified yoga teacher for over a decade. And what I learned from that experience is, like, if you ever take a yoga class, people might say, like, okay, the teacher would say, inhale, do this, like, arms up over your head, like back bend. They'll say 3 things that you should be doing, no more than 3 things, because you can't handle with one breath more than 3 things, right? So with teaching for a while, yoga for a while, I learned that, you can, when you stop and give feedback, you can say 3 things, and that's probably the max of what musicians can retain in that moment. So in my rehearsals, I usually say, stop, okay, letter A, violins, blah, 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 violins, da, 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 trumpets, da, 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 okay, let's go back. And then I try to be concise and precise of that feedback.
Yeah, interesting. And I happen to know that, you're a mom.
Yeah.
How does that impact your conducting? Because I'm sure that presents a lot of kind of practical changes,
yeah,
or challenges, but are there some things that you've learned along that process, that have actually impacted your conducting?
Yeah, I think so. It made me prioritize my life a little bit more, instead of myself being at the center of the world. Now, I'm not, obviously. I revolve around my son. So what that taught me is that to take myself less seriously, because humor is very important when you're a mom, and because nothing really goes how you want it to go. Being patient is another skill. And also just like knowing that it's really not about you. Right? It's like, how much can you contribute to either my son or the orchestra or the community that you're serving, is like, I was able to take myself out of the equation. So it actually was very helpful, and great. Like, I don't have to be the center of the world, of my world anymore. Yeah, it takes a lot of pressure off in that.
Interesting. So we've got a really interesting program tonight, and we are getting to experience a world premiere, which is neat. And it's a piece that has not been sitting around in a chest for a number of years. This is something that was written expressly for this occasion by Dr. K over there. So, Peter, could you tell us a little bit about what to expect, as much or as little as you wish to tell us about what to expect from tonight's piece?
So, this piece actually started a little over a year ago, around the time everything shut down, and we started to look at how we're going to reopen again in the fall, and this is the fall of last year. We weren't sure how many players we could have on stage, or even if it would be live or anything. And so I started with these ideas. And for any of you how many of you are familiar with Haydn's Farewell Symphony? One or two, three, just a few. So it's a great story. I don't know how true it is, but I think it was 17 something or other. Haydn is with his orchestra on vacation. The prince has got them all basically locked up and playing for him during that vacation, and they all want to go home because they can't visit their homes while they're playing for the prince. So they come to Haydn and they say, hey, we really want to get out of here. What can you do? Talk to the prince. Can you get us out of here? I'm making a long story short here. So he wrote his 45th symphony, which is the Farewell Symphony, at the end of which, during this big, fantastic final movement, he stops everything and it goes into a very slow adagio. And little by little, each musician snuffs out their candle and walks off the stage until it's just two people left. And they just go, and then apparently the next day they all went home. That's the story. So we were thinking of sort of playing off of that idea of snuffing out the candles and dissipating, but maybe doing it the other way around. So tonight's piece is going to open as my piece. The very first little lick from the first violinist is the theme from that Haydn Farewell played in reverse. And then all the little bits and pieces that he has later on in that movement, I've chopped up and reworked it as my melody for the rest of that piece. And I don't want to give away too much because there is some more dramatic aspects. And we do play with lighting as well as stage lights and stand lights. But that's basically where it comes from, is this Haydn Farewell Symphony backwards. Is that too much?
That sounds just about right. No,
Okay.
I think so. It's really interesting. So,
Teasers.
talk about, we're used to the notion of a composer sitting down and saying, I'm going to write a new piece that nobody's ever heard before. So this is something where once you kind of figured out what the idea was, you had your existing music or your existing melodic material, I guess. Is that fair to say?
Right, yes.
So you've got a tune.
Right.
And then you had to work with that tune.
Right, and at one point I was, I can't remember, I was on a plane and I was looking at the score for the Haydn and I was marking it up and just taking one measure at a time because it was on an iPad. I couldn't see the full score. And I was, hey, this is a really neat little lick here and I like the way these three notes work together, or I like these four measures or something like that. And I was just cutting it up and sort of reworking it in my mind that way. And when I eventually got home and sat down at the piano, I started to piece those things together and maybe flip those three notes over. That's the way composers work. They just mess around with it until it clicks. And along those same lines, I had a number of other influences, a number of other pieces. In fact, one of the pieces that we're playing on tonight's concert, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the Ruth Crawford Seeger, where she's using folk melodies and blending those together, somewhat like what I was doing with Haydn. And something just clicked one day, and I have written plenty of folk style tunes or fiddle tunes, and I thought maybe that's what this piece really needs, is something that's more like that, but built from the Haydn melody. And so it actually only took a few hours for me to create this melody that I really, really like, that is a fiddle tune structure, but made from Haydn's music. And I hope that it comes across that way as this sort of old world traditional sound to the melody, but still also of the 21st century, because I wanted to sound like me and not like Haydn, so I wanted to blend those things together. One other little Easter egg in there, so Haydn and Dittersdorf were friends, and Dittersdorf is a composer from that time period, and one of the pieces that we performed on our last concert in March. And the two of them used the same material in the piece from March and the Farewell Symphony, so I had to use it in this one. And the last thing that we played on stage in March, which was our last concert, is a solo with Ian Brachida, our bassist. The first thing that he plays when he comes on the stage tonight will be that same little excerpt. So I sort of built it underneath as a little wink to our orchestra, a little nod to say, hey, we're back with a live audience.
So along the lines of wanting it to sound like yourself and not just like Haydn, how did that selection of melodic material, that tune, those little snippets of notes, how did that impact the harmonies that you ended up with? Did you basically kind of use those same notes to build your harmonies, or?
Right, and a lot of times, this is a very tonal piece in a lot of ways, and it's got some minimalism to it, and minimalistic aspects, but it's largely a tonal piece the way Haydn would have written his harmonies. These are going to resolve certain ways. But at the same time, I was looking at eliminating certain notes from the typical scale to make it sound more like folk music. So when, instead of playing necessarily a regular chord, you might say, well, this note's not allowed, so I'll play it this way, and it ends up sounding much more like bagpipes or something like that.
So you've mentioned, Peter mentioned Ruth Crawford Seeger's Risolti Risolti, which is one of the other pieces on the program tonight. Kayoko, do you want to tell folks what they might expect to encounter with Risolti Risolti? Which is going to have a very different mood, I can promise, from Peter's piece.
I never heard of it before until you sent it to me. It's a very upbeat, dare I say cute, piece. It has a lot of folk element to it, and it has a handful of wind players to that piece as well, and it has a very unique color, like one flute. You don't play, right?
Right.
And like clarinets and like one trombone and trumpets, and so it has a handful of winds that add certain sprinkles to the color, and also like the folk element to it, and it's very high spirited and exciting, and it ends very comically, if I would say. So that's all I'm gonna say about that.
And Ruth Crawford Seeger is somebody who also had that experience of trying to balance motherhood and career as a musician, and those two things really seem to impact one another. During the 30s, she actually worked in a job collecting folk songs. Her job was to remain in Washington as folks traveled across the country collecting recordings made by folk singers. They'd send them back to Washington, and she oversaw the team that transcribed them, that wrote them all down and cataloged them and published them. And so the melodic material from this piece is actually taken from two of those folk songs that her team found in the southern US and sent back up to Washington for her to transcribe. So you have that same element of found melodies in this piece as well.
And her collection, Aaron Copeland was a big fan, and he went to her collection quite often. And like Rodeo and some of the other Appalachian Spring, he pulled from what she had been creating in Washington.
Yeah.
So that piece also has a very Copeland-esque sound, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's a really, really nice string orchestra piece on tonight's concert, in addition to Peter's, that many of you may not know. This is George Walker's Lyric for Strings. Yeah. And I was so excited when I saw that you'd programmed it, because this is a piece that wasn't forgotten about, it wasn't unknown, but it definitely has less of a reputation than it deserves. It's a really, really, really super pretty piece. And I'm so glad that y'all are playing it. So Kayoko, what's it like to work on that piece?
It's so heartfelt, right? The harmonies are so thick, and but simple at the same time, and there's a bit of like a momentum, although it's slow, but there's a momentum and a life to it. There's an eighth note motive that gets passed around through the orchestra, so it just feels like you're passing this energy through the orchestra, and the harmony builds, and sometimes it subsides, and it really toys with your emotion in this very short, like 6-minute piece. But I think it has everything. It's like, I don't know, it's just so intimate, and I mean, orchestra sounds great.
Yeah. It's a piece that tends to be overshadowed sometimes in the public imagination by the Barber Adagio for strings, which was written at close to the same time in the same city.
Yeah.
And so what tends to happen is that sometimes when orchestras are programming, or when on TV the music producer is going, oh, we need some slow, pretty string music, and they immediately go for Barber.
Yeah.
And so everybody kind of learns and remembers Barber, which is a wonderful piece.
Yeah.
But this piece has been overshadowed undeservedly, and it's wonderful to have a chance to hear it. I think you're going to find that it is a little bit more hopeful in the end than Barber's piece. This piece was a memorial to his grandmother, but interestingly, I think that this one you're going to find feels more hopeful, seems to end with a little bit more of a sense of hope instead of a sense of that sense of despair that we sometimes can get off of that Barber piece. And speaking of hopeful, we've got the Brahms Second Symphony, which is about, the happiest, 19th century. Is there a happier 19th century symphony?
Oh yeah, Tchaikovsky.
Okay, maybe. all right. Not many then. You sometimes doubt Tchaikovsky's sincerity anyway, but so this is a super fun piece. I know you would have conducted this many times, right?
A couple, yeah. So I'm a pseudo cellist. I took up cello in undergrad and grad just so that I can learn more about the string instruments, but I never really became good at it. So I have a special, cello always has a special place in my heart. So this symphony is so special because second movement is just opens with cello, and it's gorgeous, and any orchestral auditions you will hear this excerpt, and they sound wonderful. And throughout the piece, like the opening cello, right, second theme cello, right, they shine through this. Plus, nod to the tuba player. This is the only symphony by Brahms that has a tuba in it, so it's extra special.
This is one of the really fun things about playing this piece, is that your part is never boring.
Yeah.
You're never sitting there just counting long rests. You're never just playing something repetitive over and over and over again. Every single note that everybody's playing in this piece matters. And you have this sense that what you do matters at every moment as a player, which remarkably is not always the case, I'm here to say. Usually the first violins, everything they do matters.
Yeah,
and then for the rest of us, sometimes you feel like an afterthought. But you'll find that he's constantly shifting among instruments and among instrument families. So you get a little bit of woodwinds, and then back to the low strings, and now the upper violins, and then a little bit of a bassoon, and then back to the flute. It bounces around a lot, and it's just this kind of shimmering kaleidoscopic set of colors that we have in this piece.
But I think that's the dangerous thing about this piece, is that when you get bogged down in details, you forget the bigger picture and the line for it. So it's, as a conductor, that's like my job, is to make sure that everything makes sense. Because you have a fragment of things, right? And then if you just play a part, you're like, am I playing the melody, or what's going on, right? So when you have a score and you know what's going on, you get to put it all together. And it's my job to keep the phrase going, even though it looks fragmented on people's part. That it is a line. You're part of that line. It could be 5 notes, but you're still part of this big phrase. So that's, I think, the challenge of any Brahms symphonies. You get so bogged down in details because there's so much going on in Brahms. He's so brilliant, and there's no note that's not needed, right? Every note is deliberately written. But I just love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Brahms can be a little bit heavy sometimes. There are Brahms pieces that you eat them and it's like, boy, I need to take a nap after that meal.
Like chocolate cake.
Yeah, right. But this is one where you will just get up from this performance and just feel like $1 million.
Yeah.
I can promise you that. Now, there is one remaining piece that we haven't yet talked about on tonight's program, and that's one that is important and special in a very different kind of way. Tonight's concert in the entire classical series of the Spartanburg Philharmonic is now dedicated to the memory of Kurt Zimmerli. Kurt was a dear friend of music and a dear friend of Spartanburg. As such, he was a real benefactor to this orchestra. He was a real benefactor to our music program at Converse. But I think most importantly, he was a friend in the way that your friends are really concerned for your best interests and are thinking about your best interests, are genuinely excited when something good is happening for you. And you know that feeling that you have when you're introducing one of your good friends to another one of your good friends, and it's like, you two are gonna love each other. This evening is gonna be so much fun. The thing that I always loved about Kurt was that I had this sense that music was his good friend and Spartanburg was his good friend. And all of the benefaction that he did was done with a little bit of this sense of delight of saying to his good friend Spartanburg, hey, do you know this great 19th century composer? And allowing the music world to be present in Spartanburg at a higher level than it would have been otherwise. So while, benefactors are great, I will never sneeze on a benefactor as a music administrator, Kurt was a friend to the music world in the city of Spartanburg. And so that's why I think it's so appropriate that the piece that we're dedicating specially to him tonight is Nimrod from Elgar's Enigma Variations. Many of you know Nimrod, and you know that it's some of the most emotive and beautiful and emotionally powerful music that there is. Usually when we encounter that in European music, it's, romance is somehow involved. This is, Tristan's undying passion for Isolde or something. But what inspired this music from Elgar was his best friend, Edward Jaeger. The German word Jaeger is, of course, the German word for hunter. And so Elgar's nickname for Jaeger was Nimrod, the mighty hunter of the book of Genesis. And so this wonderful, wonderful music was written for a friend. And so it gives me special delight, to use a cliche, to welcome a friend of mine and a dear, dear friend of Kurt and Nellie, our piano professor emeritus, Doug Weeks, who's promised to pop on up and play Nimrod for us. So, Doug, if you would kindly join us. There could be no better way to end this conversation than with this.